Hello. This video is for a confirmation class that is scheduled to take place on January 6th. The text for today's lesson comes from the 17th chapter of Luke. The goal of this session is to expand on what Jesus says about having faith like a mustard seed, and we will also circle back to how this connects us to God's creation. So the key part that we're going to focus on here is actually the 5th and 6th verse of Luke 17. Jesus talks about mustard seeds a surprisingly high number of times in the Gospels. The passage that we read for today is similar to Matthew chapter 17, the 20th verse. However, the meaning of that passage is different from our passage today. Likewise, Jesus talks about mustard seeds in Matthew chapter 13, Mark chapter 4, and again in Luke chapter 13. In these three, Jesus is using a mustard seed to make a statement about the nature of the kingdom of God, in that the smallest of seeds can eventually grow into something large enough to allow birds to nest in its branches, or it's something that can grow into something large enough to become shelter for innocent baby birds. The mustard seed was known in Jesus' time for being something incredibly small that could grow into something incredibly large. So it was used by Jesus to make a distinct comparison between something that might seem tiny and insignificant to something that might seem strong and full of life. Our passage today is part of a small section that our translation of the Bible recognizes as some sayings of Jesus. Luke chapter 17, verses 1 through 10, is comprised of 3 different sayings from Jesus. The first is about not causing others to stumble in their faith while forgiving others as often as they need it. The second saying is our focus for today about the faith like a mustard seed. And the third part of the passage is something that might be a little bit confusing, but it is interpreted to say that we should not be content with doing the bare minimum to benefit our fellow humankind and to benefit God's creation while we have our time in life. In the part of the text that we're focusing on, there are 2 things happening. There's a request and then there's a response. The apostles, who at this point in the overall story of the gospel are following Jesus around and hearing all sorts of different things that Jesus is teaching them, and they asked Jesus to increase their faith. Likely, they reached a point where the apostles are recognizing that they have hit a wall that many people even today recognize they hit in their faith journey. Judging from where this short passage fits into the rest of the chapter, it is possible that the apostles have found that they are not completely ready to accept the truth that Jesus is telling them. And since it was forgiveness that was talked about right before this part, perhaps the disciples were being asked to forgive someone that it was difficult to forgive. Or perhaps not, and it might be possible that these 3 different sayings of Jesus, the 3 things that make up the section, could have been recorded from 3 different conversations and put here together just for the sake of being concise. For us right now, it doesn't actually matter if these sayings were part of the same conversation or not, because the emotion that the disciples would have felt asking Jesus to increase their faith for them is something that we feel today. We don't know what else to do in some cases other than ask God for help. And we might think it's because we have weak faith that we're not able to accomplish some task, whatever that might be. They, the apostles, would have been pleading with Jesus for him to erase the doubts from their minds and fill them with confidence. Jesus responds to the apostles by stating that if they only had the faith the size of a mustard seed, they could tell a tree to pull itself up by its own roots, to travel to a body of water and plant itself there. And the tree would actually do that. If you just had a seed of faith within you, that tiny seed can grow into a large tree of faith. There's almost an unspoken question here with the response that Jesus gives. Don't you have enough faith already? Or perhaps, don't you think you have the faith that you need? Jesus' friends would have been following him around for a fair amount of time at this point, and they would have seen and heard a lot. And despite this, despite being with Jesus directly, there's doubts in their faith, and they don't have confidence. That's something that we can all relate to. But Jesus likely knows his followers better than they know themselves, and as his response to their pleading that Jesus give them more faith, Jesus' response reminds them that even the tiniest amount of faith is enough to act on. The illustration that Jesus uses is a miracle. People telling trees to uproot, move, and replant themselves is not something that will naturally happen. Jesus does this for a reason, and it's to match a ridiculously tiny thing with a ridiculously difficult thing. Faith the size of a tiny mustard seed, if we can ever actually measure our own faith, is matched with a great tree doing something that is beyond its nature. We should not confuse this by saying that if you had a tiny amount of faith, then you would be able to do the impossible. And not being able to do the impossible must mean that you really don't have faith. We should not confuse that. That is not something that we are to take away from what Jesus is actually saying here. Our faith, the faith of each of us individually, or even the lack of our own faith, does not determine if a miracle is going to happen or not. That's all God's department. Miraculous things can happen, and they have happened. And if you look around, you might see God doing miracles in the world and in your life. But we must not be mistaken that it is our faith that is actually doing the miracles. God does God's own work on God's own time. So miracles are one thing, but our faith can do incredible things. Working out our faith and following the example that Jesus set with his teachings and his actions can do incredible things. And to circle back around to the concept of our connection with creation, I want you to think about how a tree can grow on the side of a solid rocky cliff. I want you to think about how a tree can do this, and I'm sure we've all seen pictures of trees growing out of this impossible spot. So trees are interesting in that they are able to grow in places that we think would be impossible. Faith in God can be similar in that it might grow in places and in ways that we did not expect. Our faith can be like a tree, and it starts with a little seed. That seed might be a little spark of something that we were born with, like a little spark of our own desire to seek out the truth about the universe, or a little spark to make things better for the people that we care about. Through baptism, that little seed receives some water and the nourishment of God's free gift of grace. And that extra nourishment of grace makes the little seed of our faith start to grow. The seed of a tree might be able to, well, it would be able to sprout and grow very strong in good, easy, flat soil. But for our example today, the seed might get wedged in a tiny crack in the face of a tiny crack in the rocky face of a cliff. And even there, on the unsteady ground, that seed will start to grow. So here's where we get to seeing our faith do incredible things, because as that tree begins to grow, as it grows larger and larger slowly, it can work its roots down into even the toughest of rock. And little by little, that tree can grow until eventually it might do something incredible, like split open the impossibly hard face of the rock that it was growing on. Our faith is capable of growing slowly, but with that slow growth, we might be able to be part of a splitting open of angry, dishonest, stone cold, rock solid hearts of some people, and we might be able to help them to understand the love that God has for all humankind and all of creation. And that is what can start to show what God's kingdom is really like here on earth. So when we have a little bit of faith and when we act on it, Jesus knows that we are able to do something incredible, even if it's something very slowly over a long period of time. Like a tree growing on the face of a hard, rocky cliff, growing slowly until it eventually splits that hard rock, we can recognize that our faith has grown and it is still growing. And with that faith, we find ourselves wanting to do something, help people, teach others, bring the joy of God's love, or basically caring for God's creation in some way. So for now, that does conclude this part of the lesson.